Good afternoon, everybody. This is Teresa Duncan. Welcome to Strategies for Communicating Results using the Change to Common Core linked assessments to enhance discussions about instructional practice. I see that there's somebody who said that voices are echoing, so I hope that the echo has diminished and is no longer an issue. I wanted to do just a brief overview of today's agenda. So I'm doing the welcome. I'll tell you a little bit about the REL program and about the collaboration between AERA and two of the regional educational laboratories. Rolf will be telling you a little bit about AERA's Division H. Josh, our presenter, will launch into some very interesting insights and overview of his experience at the New York City Department of Education. And then we will engage in some Q&A with both Josh, Rolf, and the Division H PD committee members. And of course, we welcome your questions and comments as well. And then we'll go back to wrap up and close it out at about 4:30. So this is who we are, just a little bit of a way to put the names and faces together. Our presenter today is Josh Thomases, who is Dean of Innovation, Policy, and Research at the Bank Street College of Education. Rolf Blank is a Senior Fellow at NORC, who will be facilitating today's webinar. He is also the Chair of Division H's Professional Development Committee. And I am Teresa Duncan. I'm Director of REL Mid-Atlantic. I will serve as host. I'm also a member of the Division H PD committee. Also joining us today are several Division H representatives, and we thank them for being willing to serve on our panel of discussants. First up is Lauren Bates, who is a Senior Advisor at REL Northwest. We also have Leslie Grant, who is a professor at William and Mary College, and Joe O'Reilly, who is Director of Research and Evaluation at Mesa Public Schools in Arizona. So let me take just a few seconds to tell you a little bit about the RELs. The Regional Educational Laboratory Program is a national program. There are 10 RELs across the United States, and as you see, we serve specific regions. REL Mid-Atlantic serves DC, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And REL Northwest serves Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. The system has been around since 1965, and during this current cycle of the RELs, we work in research alliances and partner with practitioners to conduct research. We provide technical assistance, and of course, we work to disseminate useful and accessible research-based products. And this particular webinar is an example of our work of cross-collaboration between two of the RELs, REL Mid-Atlantic and REL Northwest, as well as Division H. Here are some of the products that the RELs provide, and so you can see that there is a wide array of services that we provide to our constituents, and these are all directed around improving states and districts' ability to use data. And so certainly assessment data that we'll be talking about today is very much relevant to our mission. And so our collaboration, as I said before, is with AERA. And so I'd like to turn this over to Rolf Blank, and he can tell you a little bit more about Division H.
Thank you, Teresa. We appreciate this opportunity to join efforts with the REL. AERA, as many of you know, is a national organization of researchers and evaluators. Division H is actually one of the oldest parts of sections of the AERA, and currently we have over 2,500 members of Division H that work in school districts, state departments of education, universities and colleges, and in professional organizations. And as you probably know, many of you are part of Division H. A lot of our work has centered around the annual meeting and sessions and presentations at that annual AERA meeting. Last year, under our new Vice President, Ollie Stevenson, we initiated a professional development committee, and we got started last summer about thinking about ways to expand our work between the annual, or before and after the annual meetings, and to develop other ways of working with our members, particularly new incoming members, to the work of research and evaluation, and how we might influence their work and have them share their experience and knowledge. So one of the ideas was a webinar, and we're hoping that this first webinar will kick off to some further efforts in the webinar area. We also are doing a pre-conference session on April 16th. If you're registering for the annual meeting, you may want to look for that. It's going to focus on training and leadership at the local level for using data. We decided for this first webinar, to focus on communication about the assessments and assessment results that are tied to the Common Core standards. We talked about a number of possible topics for the webinar, including the change in types of assessments and the degree to which assessments are aligned to standards, and a number of other issues related to the change in assessment results that many of you already have experienced in your school districts, and people are getting ready for changes with the new Common Core linked assessments. But we decided to focus first on the question of how to anticipate changes in assessment results. How can we, as educators and as researchers, help prepare the public for what's going to be happening? And we received volunteers to help with that from the people in New York City, Josh and Lauren, who had some experience in doing this a couple of years ago. And we decided that fit really well with our topic. And so this webinar is focusing on the question of the new assessments and the Common Core links to those new assessments, but particularly about how we as researchers and evaluators might work with educators to prepare them and to anticipate the questions that are going to come up about the assessment results as we move forward in this era of Common Core. Here's some information on the slide now about that pre-conference I mentioned, and we hope that you'll register for that. Division H members, if you sign up for the pre-conference, we're going to help you out with paying for that membership. Based on paying from your membership, we're going to help you with the cost of the pre-conference registration. So look for information about that coming from Division H. Now we're going to turn it over to Josh Thomases, and he's going to provide slides and discussion about their experience in New York City. And we thank him for joining us today.
Thank you, Rolf, and thank you to the RELs and to Division H for inviting me to speak. I think the first thing I want to begin with is just to provide some context of who I am. I've been in education for over 20 years as a teacher, as a school leader, as an administrator for New York City, and now as Dean at Bank Street College of Education. And while today's conversation focuses on the years towards the implementation of the Common Core exams, I speak to you with the voices of all of those experiences. I think it's very important to begin with a larger context, because the story in New York City, as is the story now everywhere in the country, sits within a much larger frame. And though we had significant successes that I will talk about today in New York City, those successes are deeply framed by a much broader challenge that I think everyone probably on this call is aware of, which is that the Race to the Top plans, which called for significant supports to teachers and schools for new tests and for a new evaluation system, that the order got flipped, and that we, as a nation, and certainly this was true in New York, started too hard on accountability without getting the right supports to make sure people understood how to get there. And that a lot of the noise that we're seeing is being generated out of that because of a loss of faith from educators that this was more than a gotcha. And I start there not because I don't think there's enormous value in moving towards the Common Core. I deeply believe that. But rather that likely undercurrent in this conversation is going to be this broader implication. And just as we were in New York, you will be asked to speak to that, and will at least need to signal your set of beliefs around that broader challenge. And I also say it because the successes in New York have not been displayed across the country because they have been washed under this larger challenge around the Common Core. But that's not to say that there wasn't significant movement in New York City in communicating what these changes meant. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about those. So first I want to give you a little bit of a map. And I was responsible in New York City for implementation of the Common Core during this entire time. In July of 2010, New York State adopted the Common Core state standards. And in the fall of that year, we began instructional work with 100 schools and really thinking through and piloting what would it take to move instruction to fully align to this new standards. We continued that over the course of the next several years and then really began a serious communication campaign focused on why Common Core matters in September of 2012. The engagement around the test scores really did not start until about 4 months before the test in January of 2013. In April of 2013, the tests were taken, and in August, the test scores were released. I think the last piece of context is obviously these were not PARCC or Smarter Balance tests. The New York State made a decision to shift its 3 through 8th grade tests to align as fully as possible with the Common Core state standards. They were very clear that they couldn't get all the way there, that there were limitations in what those changes would be, but made the decision to move towards a new, more challenging test as a way to get New York State out in front and accelerate that work. So that's the context in which we're functioning. The other piece of context is as we began to look at the incoming tests, we noticed there were 3 other states who had had new tests in recent time, and all had seen massive drops in test score proficiency. And so the challenge is very clear about how do you frame this. But as we thought about it, what became more clear for us was that there was a very important opportunity to have a conversation with the core constituents, starting with the children and families we serve, and then with the broader community, around what matters in what we're teaching. What do we want children to know and be able to do? To do that, you have to address people's concerns and fears, but they are paying attention in a particular sort of way that is not always easy to get. And so using that as a teachable moment, to steal a term, becomes a really important opportunity. So this forms the framework of the rest of the presentation, the 6 steps we took to engage. But I do want to spend one more moment on the pre-work, which is that in New York City, the only reason we were able to have the kinds of conversation we were able to have around the shifts to the Common Core and what they meant for children is because we had engaged in a substantive and sustained set of work around instruction and around the shifts that needed to happen in instruction. And I won't say much more about it. It's not the topic of today's webinar, but I think it's important to note. Everywhere where our messages resonated, it's because teachers and schools and families recognized that something had in fact begun to shift, that we weren't talking about a theoretical thing, but they could see it in their classrooms and that they were generally pleased with it. And given the size of New York City, with 1.1 million students and 1,800 schools, the places where there was a lot of noise, as there certainly was, where people were quite upset, were the places where there had not been significant instructional shifts, where rather things had not moved. And so students and families and teachers couldn't recognize what we were talking about. And so this is predicated on that deep instructional work. And you'll see that resonating as we go through these 6 steps. Before we dig in, I think there are some important principles that I wanted to flag first and foremost. First is that however you message this, the whole point of this work, the point of the Common Core State Standards, is what we want our children to know and be able to do, and what our families and what we ourselves, for those of us who have children, hope for our children. And I think we as educators need to talk in that way around this shift. This is not simply a technical shift. It's not simply a new exam with new mechanisms for using it and new ways for evaluating it. It's actually a conversation about our children and our hopes and dreams for them. And the more clearly we can articulate that connection, the more powerful I think the message will resonate. The second is supporting your schools. Not only are they doing the work that's important, as I said earlier, but they are the best messengers. What came through again and again in New York City is that we have 75,000 teachers, and the children and families in those teachers' classrooms looked to those teachers to signal them about the messages we were giving them. Where teachers said, yes, this makes sense to me, again, we saw the messages hit. And where teachers said no, we saw the messages not land as well. And all those 75,000 teachers have friends in their communities and people that know them. And they are your best messengers. And so both because it's the right thing to do in supporting our children and because to get the message out, there is nothing that can compete with the number of teachers in your school communities and in your communities. It becomes important to start there. The third principle is that you've got to figure out how to tell the tough news early. It became very clear to us that if we didn't confront head-on what the shift would mean, it would look like it was washing over us rather than an expected change. More on that later, and worth acknowledging, part of the success in New York City ends up being that we do have good news to tell in the end. The proficiency rates do drop dramatically, but as you'll see, there is positive news to build on. And then finally, and I have no experience as a communications expert, so certainly defer to them, but what I heard from folks in that field, and certainly what we learned, is that in this time of enormous information overload, consistency of message from as many voices and with as much clarity as possible becomes critically important. Okay.
Josh, this is Teresa. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like some folks are having trouble hearing you, and so if you could just put the phone closer to your mouth, maybe.
Okay. Is that any better?
You're super loud in my ear, but I think others have been having problems, so I think that'll be great. Thank you so much.
Okay. My apologies. With that, let's jump into the first step, which is to frame the challenge and the standards. This is not yet about the test. This is about the standards. And what you have on slide 19 is a translation that we did for what was at the heart of the shifts, the instructional shifts inside of the Common Core. And there were whole sets of work that we did with schools and teachers and principals and then with their communities around what these shifts actually meant for what they expected to see in their classrooms. And it becomes very important to start there. Why are we doing this and what are we expecting to see? And I won't spend all the time one could on this slide and what's behind it, but just call out a couple key points. First, one of the concerns we heard in New York City, for example, was that this was the end of fiction. And so we spent some time helping people understand and recall that reading in social studies and science, particularly as you move out of the early elementary grades, becomes absolutely critical and important. And that when we're saying read as much nonfiction as fiction, we're saying there's still an important place for fiction, but that human beings who can fully be actors in the social and scientific worlds can do so because they can read and gather information on their own, and we want our children to do it. Or we spent time on what it meant to be able to discuss reading using evidence. Or in math, we talked about the math debates, about those who believe that it's all about speed and accuracy versus those who believe that we need to really understand application to real-world problems. And work to help people understand that anybody who works with math in the real world outside of schools sees that as a spurious argument because both are absolutely necessary. And so we spent a bunch of time framing the standards and explaining why they matter and why they matter to kids. And one way that we did this was by actually using the exams themselves. And both PARCC and Smarter Balance have examples out there, and I would encourage you to utilize them. And in this slide, you have an example from the old test, the way the test used to be, and from the new test that was representative of this new, more aligned to Common Core standard. And if we were to spend a bunch of time working through this slide, and we did this with teachers and principals and then with families, you ask some questions about, well, what does a child need to know and be able to do, and what kind of thinking do they need to do to answer these two questions? And as you will likely recognize, it's substantively different. And if you do this work with parents and families, they often say, well, I want my child to be able to think like that kind of question. And it provides the reference point for what this really means, what the tests really are, and does a bunch of work demystifying these new tests, this new higher standard, by making it real about what it means for what children know and are able to do. Given that, then you step to the next challenge. How do you explain the work that you've been doing to support schools? I merely have this as an example of the kinds of things that we did in New York City, and I'm not going to take the time here to walk you through each of them. Suffice it to say that the work needs to be real, actual work that teachers and schools can recognize and utilize, that this needs to be concrete, needs to resonate with non-teachers. Oh, this is something. Oh, I can ask my teacher, how are they using this? And needs to communicate the confidence you feel in the work that you've done. And now we get to the beginning of the real difficult conversation, to talk about the data and to talk about what you expect to happen here. And this is not easy to do. And we spent a lot of time, and what you see on slide 24 is sort of the best summary I could give of the logic model we gave around why this test was changing and what it would mean. And at the heart of that logic model, and in New York State, the tests are on a 4-point standard, and we basically boiled it down to, on the old test, a level 3, which generally seems to mean to people, quote unquote, passing, that on the old test, the level 3 meant readiness to graduate from high school, and that on the new test, a level 3 would mean readiness to succeed in college or careers. And framed like that, it's still scary because it means a huge shift, but it's resonant because it touches on something at the heart of what children and families are hoping from schools, which is that they're going to provide opportunities to their children or to themselves to have access to the kinds of choices and options represented by readiness to college, even if you choose not to go. So that was the logic model, but we backed it up with data. And this is just some of the data from New York City. And what it frames, and I'll walk you through a little bit, mostly to help understand the story we were trying to build. And the heart of the story is what's at the top, that there was steady improvement, but that we were lagging on college readiness. That we went from 47% graduation rates to 66% graduation rates. That there was a similar move in college readiness from 16% to 29%. And then on the right, you have some examples that suggest that this is just beyond the test scores, the number of students taking AP exams, or the number of students enrolling in our local city universities. That's what CUNY stands for. And this gives us an anchor to say we're on the move. And to also say, but none of us can be satisfied when only 3 in 10 of our students are graduating ready for college and careers. By doing this, we're already having the tough conversation. We weren't waiting for the test to have it, but we said, let's have it right now. What do we want to have our children know and be able to do, and what options do we want for them as they leave our schools? And similarly, we looked at our NAEP scores as the best barometer we have in the early grades, which show a similar number, percentage rather, of students approaching that readiness bar. We also use the NAEP scores because the state had identified NAEP as the most likely benchmark for where they were going to set the cut scores. And so our best guess of what our outcomes were going to be was 28% proficient in math and 26.5 proficient in ELA. And so we wanted it there so that we were putting out the data around the tough conversation. And I don't want to wash over how difficult this is, and particularly in communities where the proficiency rates were low, or where teachers were particularly upset, or where teachers were against the test. But by us going out there and talking about it, it meant we were taking the conversation to them rather than waiting for them to come to us, which did mean that there were lots of community meetings that myself and my team and our superintendents and our principals had that were not easy. And what we encouraged all of us to do and tried to do was to stick to the core conversation, which is, yes, this is not the news we want to be giving, but it is the news we have. So let's talk about what needs to change to reach more of our students. And even, and this was not true in every case by any stretch, but in the majority of cases, that resonated enough to generate a productive conversation about what we need to, what we as adults need to learn how to do better to more effectively reach more and more children. Having set that context, there's then an important step to explain those core concerns and explain the plan, rather, to continue progress. This begins with some very blunt questions of, my child, our children are not passing the current tests. So what are you talking about raising standards when you can't even get them to the basic level of proficiency? And that is a very challenging conversation to have, and I can talk more about it. We attempted not to sugarcoat it and to acknowledge where we hadn't succeeded, which, just as some more context in New York City, we were at the point we were having these conversations 10 years into a mayor's tenure. And so there wasn't any, it was somebody else's failure. It was where we hadn't succeeded, and used it to ask the questions and then talk about the specific resources we were seeking to put in place to try and tackle those. But they're fair questions to ask, and fair questions for us to ask as a country where we haven't successfully reached many of these students and provided them with the supports necessary to reach mastery. But we started with the most struggling students and then talked about the support and the strategy for the broader instructional work. And talked during this engagement time about our plan for after the tests. We didn't wait till the test to say, now we have a plan. We said, here's what we're thinking about, and here's how we're planning to do it. And there were lots of holes and lots of concerns people raised and not enough resources for everything we wanted to do. But we looked at that as a productive conversation to be having well in front of the tests, and framed differently how we strategize together, even with those who were very upset at us, to think about what it would mean to get ready for those moments. And then, and this becomes absolutely critically important, we had to address some key operational issues. Let's start with students. Parents and families need to understand what this means for promotion decisions, what this means for summer school, how we're going to explain that to them, and what they should expect to do, what and why. And certainly one concrete piece of advice, and there's an example in the appendix that you can flip to, is to map out those concrete steps as much as possible and how you're going to operationalize and address the concerns parents have about what does this mean for my child. It doesn't take all the winds out of the sails of the concerns and criticisms, but it does flag that you're attending to their concerns about how am I going to know what when. And the clearer you can be on it, you can sort of partition off the parents who are simply asking the question, what does this mean for my child and when am I going to know? And make sure that they can breathe easier, at least knowing how it's going to work, and that this isn't going to get lost in the bureaucratic world of your particular or our particular Department of Education. And then the question is are children, teachers, or schools going to be punished for this change? And this is certainly where what I talked about at the beginning, about where we've gotten the flip of the tests and the supports off, became very important to name. Now, New York City we could be fairly straightforward about it. For students, we had figured out how to focus the summer school resources we had on who we anticipated to be our most struggling learners, and to say that up front, and to say there wouldn't be a massive expansion of summer school, and to say that we weren't going to hold back huge numbers of students, that we expected those numbers to be relatively stable. And for students who were not at Common Core proficient, we expected that to happen over time. At the point at which these tests came out, we had not yet actually completed a teacher evaluation deal, and so these tests were not a part of the teacher's evaluation for that year. And finally, in terms of our evaluation of schools, there was a strong peer index in the way we looked at schools, so we compared schools to each other. so that even if you had significant numbers of students struggling, we looked at how you did compared to similar schools. And again, that didn't address all concerns, but it framed a thoughtful way of thinking about it that was defensible and seemed worth consideration. The step 5 is about the supports you give for school-based staff to follow up on support and communications. And partially this is professional development, and partially this is training and resources and new curriculum and the like. And again, given the focus of this, I'm sort of noting that, but not spending as much time on it. If it's useful, I'm happy to spend more time on it during the Q&A time. But what I want to focus on is what the implications were for what schools needed to have these conversations. And as we began talking with principals about this, one of the first pieces of feedback that came back was, it's all well and good for you, Josh, or Chancellor, to stand up and say this to us, but how are our school communities going to know that this is what you're saying? We're going to have school communities who are upset at us, and we need a frame. And so we gave them that frame. We posted a video that we produced a video. It wasn't a long video, but it was 3 to 4 minutes of the Chancellor talking through the messages that were at the heart of the way we decided to talk about this, and you'll see it in a moment, so that they could play it and say, see, it's not just us where the test scores are dropping. This is a citywide conversation. And we produced a letter from the Chancellor to parents that not all schools gave out, but most schools gave out, that again contextualize it. And we produced some very strength-based tips for parents. And we're very explicit. We didn't want parents turning and saying to their child, why are you so bad? Why are you so dumb? Why aren't you good at this? And so really tried to produce the kinds of supports that would allow school communities to talk about, well, what are we as families going to say when those results come back? And as we got ready for the actual test results in the summer of 2013, we produced a set of materials, as we knew that principals were very nervous about coming back to school. There had been a lot of announcements about the test, and they wanted to have supports about how they have these first conversations. Because for all of the prep work that we did, it was still for the schools that saw drops in proficiency rates of 40, 50, 60 points, still a very difficult conversation to have. And they wanted our help with it. And so we built a PowerPoint that they could utilize, and we built a facilitator guide, a lesson plan that would help the school look at that data and think about next steps rather than be pointing fingers at the principal or at the teachers. And to really construct a way to do that dialogue. Now, we didn't mandate that anybody use these materials, but we wanted to ensure they had them. So the interesting thing is I'm almost 30 minutes into this presentation, and I've still only talked about the communication plan with schools. And that is reflective of where we invested our time and energy, and sort of the message that I keep trying to come back to around how important your core constituents of your pedagogues and your families are. But that isn't to say that we didn't do the public engagement campaign. What you see on slide 34 are 2 advertisements that went up on New York City subways. Our chancellor and his deputy and our state chancellor and state commissioner went together to the editorial boards. We met with business and community groups. I spent as much time as I could meeting with basically any group that would meet with me, from after-school program directors to Fortune 500 companies, to talk about what was coming and to get out there as clearly as we could that we expected this to happen, that this change was purposeful, and that it mattered for what we wanted our children to know and be able to do, and for our aspirations for them. This spring, we're aiming higher as the core message. And what you have on slide 35 are the heart of some of the messages. And when the test scores came out, the New York City Mayor and Chancellor and the New York State Chancellor and Commissioner issued a joint statement around those tests. And they said, the statement is available online if you want to see the whole thing, but in those 4 bullets, you have the heart of our message. This is about what we want for our children. We are confident our students can rise to the challenge. We have known this is coming, and it's an important change. And that message resonated. So what were the results? At the top, you see the results in their word form. We had similar drops to some of those states we saw at the beginning. A drop by half in math, from 60 to just under 30%, and by 20 points in ELA. But that's not how we framed the drop. Rather, we connected the drop to those NAEP results we had been talking about for months. And in that context, it wasn't a drop. Slight growth in math and essentially even in ELA, which allowed us to say, having done that work, this is what we expected. This is the tough conversation we need to have, but there's no surprise here. Now, important to say that our performance was significantly stronger than the rest of the state, and certainly framed I think, the response. And so what you have here on the far left, you have math and English. On the far left of each graph, you have New York City's performance. In the middle, you have the other 4 large urban school districts in New York State who have similar demographic statistics. And then on the right, you have New York State's overall performance, which is generally a whiter and higher socioeconomic status than New York City. And so the reality is, even as we saw a massive drop in proficiency, New York City significantly closed the gap with the rest of the state. And it gave us a strong talking point to counteract all the significant concerns. That isn't to say that there wasn't a lot of noise, and I haven't given you all of the data, but there was, for those who are aware, there were lots of places to be concerned. Schools that had very few, if any, students proficient, significant weakness in our performance with English language learners and students with special needs. A lot of holes and a lot of concerns were raised, but the overall message that this is what we expected and that this is the conversation we need to have as a city ultimately resonated. And it resonated across multiple constituencies. And on slide 38, there are 2 quotes, one from a teacher and one from a key business leader in New York City. The teacher one resonated enormously for me. Raising the bar is scary and will require all of us invested in improving education to work harder and even relearn parts of our craft. But I'd rather take that leap now than spend another decade or more being lulled into a false sense of security, only to find my students still aren't ready to be productive citizens. I think a really important and resonant message. Kathy's as well, but if one of our key constituencies is teachers, I thought it worth focusing there. And I've not done a study of New York Times editorial pages, but I don't personally know of another case where all 3 major dailies released editorials on the day of the test supporting the change and essentially articulating the message. ultimately was part of the evidence that we had gotten the message across. And the other part of the message, the other part of the evidence was these test scores came out 3 to 4 weeks before New York City's Democratic primary, which was largely seen as who was going to succeed Mayor Bloomberg. And these test scores results did not become a political football. They stayed a really difficult and important educational conversation, both for Mayor Bloomberg and then for candidate and now Mayor de Blasio. And that was ultimately our goal, and in that I think we were quite successful. So before I close and open up to questions, I wanted to just revisit a couple guiding principles and sort of flag the key challenges. So we got the message through, but the hardest places to talk about were the children that were far behind, the schools that for all intents and purposes were places of instructional failure. And we had a lot of very upset school communities where there weren't easy answers, where teachers and principals were trying as hard as they knew how, and yet students weren't learning what they needed to learn. And for those of you in district leadership on this call, you know those are the most difficult conversations to have, and a lot of them had to happen in the fall of 2013. And similarly, as we sat down with the families and advocate communities around our students who really did not perform well, students with disabilities or and English language learners, very difficult conversations to have about what are the supports that need to be put in place. And what does it mean to have these demands, for example, around language development for students who are still making sense of the language. Nothing in what I'm saying is meant to suggest that we figured out how to dodge those conversations. At best, we figured out how to have them head on and got respect from folks, even those who were upset, for not ducking it. And we did not reach anybody by a long shot. There were lots of folks who didn't hear the message, got confused about the message, or didn't believe the message. It certainly was not a cure-all. And then probably the hardest piece, which brings us full circle, is that the tests that we had in New York were not giving all of the instructional signals we wanted them to give. And so we struggled with figuring out how to talk about the step that it took and also acknowledge those limitations. And PARCC and Smarter Balance represent enormous steps forward in how we think about testing. And I give enormous credit to the folks who have worked on those. And this is one test around one portion of the set of skills we want students to know and be able to do. An absolutely critical one from all of the research for successful participation in our democratic society, and yet not the full measure of what we want for our children. And figuring out how to have that conversation is not easy. And figuring out how to have that conversation in the multitude of ways that those test results are used is even more complicated. As policymakers at multiple levels of government explore with using these tests to decide performance outcomes for students and teachers in schools, even as they're new tests and even as the psychometricians are still doing their work. And I think we as educators need to figure out how to talk intelligently and thoughtfully about those challenges, to neither use them to bash or discredit the important progress being made here, or whitewash them to pretend that those challenges don't exist. And I think in the next stage, as we look at the challenges happening nationally around the Common Core state standards, that will only become more important. I want to thank and acknowledge a ton of folks in New York City who I won't name who did enormous amount of tireless work around this project, and particularly thank and acknowledge Lauren and Teresa and Rolf and others who helped bring me to today. And I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Josh. Rolf, should we bring the discussants in then?
Thanks, Teresa. This is Rolf, and I just wanted to give my thanks to Josh for his leadership on stepping forward on this message. And I just wanted to reflect on the fact that as a Division H, as we thought about webinar topics, this message fits perfectly because we decided not to jump in to immediately talk about the new assessments, PARCC and Smarter Balance, and what they are and how to interpret those scores and how the tests are changing, et cetera. So we decided to step back a little bit and what are the key issues that we need to think about in terms of standards, in terms of what schools need to understand, and is there really a change that people need to think about? And that's really the message that Josh brought forward. And I think it's great. I really I'm noticing a lot of questions from people in the audience, but I'd like to see if we can ask a couple of members from our professional development committee to jump in and give their take on what Josh has brought forward, and if they had a particular comment or question. Lauren, do we want to start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Rolf. So just for full disclosure, Rolf alluded to this, but I used to work with Josh in New York City Department of Ed, and so I do have a little bit of extra information about this. And I was following the questions in the chat and actually thought there were some really interesting points made about terminology use. Josh didn't shy away from using the phrase drop in test scores, framing it that way, and some people thought, well, maybe that's sort of setting the wrong sort of tone. Maybe you're not communicating enough about having a new baseline. And I wonder if Josh could respond to that and why New York City decided to go ahead and frame it as a drop instead of a new baseline.
I think we did a little bit of both. We didn't pretend that the drop wasn't going to be experienced because from what do parents or teachers care about? They care about what happened to Juan or Joanne. And what happened to my child? And if my child I thought was proficient and now I'm being told is not on track to college, then to say there's not a drop feels like you're pretending. But we did hit that new baseline tone as to where we were going, but we understood that we needed to bring our schools and communities to that conversation because they were going to experience quite viscerally, as the results came back, the implications for children that they knew. And it was going to feel like something that wasn't a new baseline because they thought they knew something about how they were doing, and now they had a different piece of information. And we, in fact, talked to many schools and families who had particular conversations with the children who had previously thought of themselves as on track because they'd been scoring at a level 3 and now we're behind. And that was a group worth talking to and worth acknowledging.
Thanks, Josh. Let's go to Joe O'Reilly in Arizona. And Joe, what's your comment or question, observation?
Well, I want to thank Josh and New York City for going first, a year ahead of most of us in terms of giving these tests, because I've used your results and the Smarter Balance cut points and to prepare people for what's coming. And it really does open their eyes somewhat when they see the changes in New York, Kentucky, and with the Smarter Balance. Two things for Josh. One is some of the tools for schools that you mentioned, are they available on the web somewhere? Because those of us in schools love to steal things from others. And I heard you talk about the lower students, the ELL students, the special ed students, the schools that have only one-digit pass rates. What about the parents who believe in their child's exceptionalism? And how did you deal with that? Because that was a pain point I could hear 2,500 miles away from New York in the press about the New York assessments.
So there are absolutely tools on the web. I have been out of the Department of Education for just under a year now, but some of the links, we try to put as many of the links that were still available in the presentation so that folks can click on them and they are live. One of the pieces that I didn't speak to that I think is worth flagging, and Lauren, I'll try to put it up on the website, is, well, it's not on the appendix. My apologies. But it's in the appendix. There we produce something called the Expect Success Guides. The message being expect success from your children. And that guide does a deeper translation of the Common Core and then answers the first good question that parents often ask, which is, so what can I do to help? And so certainly, and we'll try and maybe get that slide up there, but certainly would be worth looking at and is still available online. The parent exceptionalism question falls into a bunch of categories, right? There were groups of parents that made the decision, and schools that made the decision to opt out from taking the test. The press tried to make that a huge story, and I think some of it sifted across the country. We decided not to confront it head on. That we essentially encourage schools to encourage families to take the test. But the predominance of the places where that happened were where very strong school communities who generally had very strong instructional practices were concerned about the impact. And we decided not to sort of raise the stakes by fighting with them that they had to. We created what we wanted to make sure was that every parent knowingly made an active decision to not take the test and didn't feel cajoled or pressured by a school community to make a decision, and decided to put our efforts into making sure there was a quality process rather than in leaning in to that group to try to take the test. And then I don't remember the number, but it was a very tiny number of non-test takers. I think it's growing as, to my last slide, as we're still struggling with the question of what do these tests mean and what should they be used for. And I think that's part of where we saw noise from that community, and they're asking good questions. There was another group of families that principals struggled with who didn't believe the outcomes. And the stronger of school communities were able to look at student work from the student over the year and begin to talk concretely about what needed to happen next. But in a certain sense, this was the tough conversation this new test generated. That, Juan had been doing well on all of his, in all of his classes. What do you mean he's been getting A's? And there's an important conversation to be had here that where there's value in a benchmark test. That if a student is being told by all of his teachers that he's doing quite well, but he's not on track to college, that conversation has to happen, and it's not a quick one. And we encourage schools to go through a process over the course of the following year around shifting it, because it meant they probably had to shift their practices, which is ultimately where there's value in this. If those practices shift in productive ways towards more complicated writing and more complicated argumentation that asks for the kinds of things inside of the Common Core.
Thanks, Josh. We'd like to shift to Leslie in Virginia. What were your observations or comments, questions, Leslie?
Thank you, Rolf, and thank you, Josh. Very informative presentation about New York's experience. And it seems to me that, just reviewing your presentation and listening to your experience, that New York began preparing around 2010, both in terms of instructionally and then working on educating the community and then reaching out to media. And so what I'm wondering is for districts that might not have that 3-year window to begin to prepare at this point, or are just thinking about the communication plan now, what would you advise would be a priority focus to get the word out or to begin the preparations both within school district and outside of school district? What should folks really pay attention to in the short run here?
You have to tell the bad news before the tests are taken. That'd be my first. You have to figure out a way to talk to your school communities about what's coming and about what you're expecting. I think the little research that we did about the states that went before us is those that lost control of the dialogue lost it on that point. If people are surprised about the drop, once they're surprised, you can't say, no, we knew that was happening. You have to come out in front. And so, and remember, if you go back to that slide, we didn't start talking about the test changes until January, early February, right where we are now. So this is a perfect time to, sort of to scramble together a set of conversations in your schools and in your communities. And it was March where we had asked schools to have meetings with their parent-teacher associations to talk through the tests that were being taken in April. It wasn't that far in advance, but even doing it that close to the test showed that we knew it was coming. And then having done that, you can shape messages around that and shape the supports and so on. But you have to, that's the first thing you have to do. The second thing would be make sure you know what the operational consequences of it are. What does it mean for kids, right? It starts there. If you don't figure out what it's going to mean for kids, and depending on your local rules, whether it's promotion or summer school, you need to be able to answer those questions, or you look like you got caught with your pants down. And so the second thing is to get the operational right. And then the third is to start talking about instruction and to really use this to have those conversations about what we want our children to know and be able to do, and what it means for what kinds of instructions happen in our classroom, and what you've been doing to support that. But the first two things are you have to get out in front on the data. That's the only thing you will run out of time on. And you've got to make sure that it doesn't create an operational nightmare, because for those in districts, once you're in the midst of an operational nightmare, everything else gets sort of thrown under the bus. You got to make sure you're figuring that out.
Thanks, Josh. This, Ralph, I just wanted to follow up on one thing myself. A couple of little things. One is we had a couple of questions people have typed in about the fact that really the message should be about not so much about proficiency levels, but the fact that we're raising standards for students and teachers. It sounds like your message was more about how the tests are going to be different, but we need to change our practice in anticipation of that. So did you try to bring it down to the school level without emphasizing too much the fact that we have these Common Core standards?
At the heart of saying this is about whether students are prepared to succeed in college and careers is that we're raising standards. What I learned in talking about raising standards is that that's very inside baseball for non-educators. And so that there needs to be a way to translate what that means. Why weren't they there before? What does this mean? And so all of the work that I sort of pointed to at the beginning around explaining the Common Core and explaining what the shifts in practice are a way to make raising standards look real, look palpable to non-educators about how children might be thinking, and to have people so that they can say, oh, that makes sense to me. I think a lot, right, there's a lot of ways to talk about the resistance to the Common Core, but one of the places to talk about it is deep confusion about what the Common Core is actually describing. And so I absolutely think you need to talk about raising standards, but you need to do it in a way that resonates for the audience. If teaching is learning, they have to learn what you're talking about and why it matters.
Great. That's glad we emphasized that point. A couple of people commented about the what's the, how do you start a new baseline? Do you start with 2013, or in our case, now we're going to be talking about starting with 2015 in a lot of states with the new assessments. But I wanted to emphasize that you brought out the early on the question of where we are as a city in relation to NAEP. And I'm not sure too many places have used that strategy before of saying, this is our benchmark. Where are we with this national assessment? How did that work out in the long run, do you think?
Well, its core purpose was just to do what's on slide 36. And in that, NAEP is not a recognized thing outside of education circles, but allowed us to say these numbers are familiar to us. And so in that sense, it gave us the data to put on a slide instead of putting 2012 proficiency 60%, 2013 proficiency 29%, which looks like a very dramatic drop. We were able to put what's on the slide on page 36. And so in that sense, it said they've known this. Now, some people were upset saying, well, if you've known this, why haven't you been doing anything about it? And we tried to talk about what we have been doing. When you're moving a very large school system, everybody can point to your failures as evidence that maybe you don't have any successes. And part of the challenge is pointing to the successes is suggesting that we're moving in the right direction.
Great. Teresa, I see you're back. Are you wanting to jump in, or do you want to bring any other folks from the audience in?
Well, one question that was sent along before, as part of the registration, we asked folks if they were interested in sending in any questions beforehand. And so I thought this was, so these are some sort of good takeaway-less questions. What do you think, Josh, would be the greatest lesson learned from New York City's experience? And this other one is a more metaphysical one. What is the shared definition, if there is one, about what it means to be well-educated in this country? So I throw those out there for...
I mean, my takeaway from this is I started from a very politically brutal reality, which is in the midst of a mayoral campaign, we were going to see what was going to be couched as a huge drop in scores, and that's not the way we wanted to talk about it. We wanted to talk about setting this new baseline and acknowledge that experience, but contextualize it. And what I came to in thinking about how do we message that is this opportunity that I framed at the beginning, which is for a very constructive conversation, if you can orchestrate it around what we want for our children and that very big question about what does it mean to be college ready in this society. and what do we need to do as adults to figure out how to support all of our children to get there. And often I would stand up and say that, and I believe this in my heart, that everybody, all of us need to learn how to do our jobs differently. That one of the things that often happens in education is people point and say, I've got my piece covered if only everybody else would just do X. And I think, and we tried to hold out that that attitude is off, that if we knew how to get 100% of our children to meet this new standard, or even 80%, we would be doing it. And that means we've got to learn differently. And that's true for administrators, and it's true for district administrators and building administrators, and it's true for teachers, and it's true for folks in schools of education. And we need to go through that process, and we need to be in a conversation about what good enough looks like. The other half of it gets back to what are the tests used for. And I think challenging our policymakers to make sure that the tests don't equal college readiness and don't become an easy number to just use to assess the whole piece is very, very important, because it's actually wrong. And I'll move you back quickly to some of the college readiness data in New York City. If you look at that second column, you see that we're reporting 3 in 10 college ready. When we look at the data of which of our children go to college and how they do and how they persist, it's actually 4 in 10. Dr. Pedro Noguera has reported that number. But we didn't report that because our best predictors of the data we have from our tests is only 3 in 10. And so there's a gap there that's an interesting gap of children who we think aren't ready but get to college and succeed. And it's still only 4 in 10. It's not 8 in 10 or 9 in 10, but it's a not insignificant number of children who are showing skills, and whether you talk both in reading and writing and math that don't show up on the test, but also in the social emotional space. There is a lot of work we did in New York City to try and get our language around that. We talked about academic and personal behaviors, and I think if you Google that in New York City, you'd come up with a document on it. We can try and find it, that gave our best language to all of the different domains of expertise that are actually what it means to be fully college ready. These tests are a critical part of that, and I don't want anything that I'm saying to suggest that somehow it's not important to figure out how to read and write and do math in ways aligned with the Common Core state standards. They're just not the end-all and be-all. And part of our responsibility is to have that conversation with our school communities, to create policies that support that conversation, and to have that conversation with policymakers as well.
Thanks. Let's see if our discussants want to jump back in. Joe or Lauren or Leslie, do you have any further observations, questions?
This is Lauren. I'll jump in. There were some other questions that came in the chat that I thought might be of interest. One of them was a little nuts and bolts about data use. So Josh, I'm not sure how much detail you can go into this, but someone had a question about how within New York City Department of Ed we matched schools, so there was a peer indexing across schools so that there'd be more of an apples-to-apples comparison. And someone was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about what sort of kind of factors were matched and what that process was like.
So let's talk on 2 levels. I saw that question as well. Thanks for bringing it up. So just to be clear, for the district level, we used the closest comparison districts, which were the other 4 large urban school districts in New York State. It's not a perfect comparison, but it was the closest we could come. And Nassau and Suffolk, somebody asked, were not on that list because they demographically don't compare. at the school level, we refined over the course of years, and be happy to follow up with the person who asked, but we refined over the course of years an algorithm to understand what was the what were the most likely predictors of success. And so we started with student demographic data and student performance data, and refined over years understanding, well, there seems to be where there are interesting performance differences that are worth understanding. So for example, within English language learners, there's significantly different performance outcomes if they're very recent immigrants versus whether they are they have been in the country for a very long time and are still speaking predominantly in a language other than English. And so catching those became important. We had hoped for a simpler version, but the more we looked at student performance and school performance, the more we understood that it was worth doing those deeper analytics. I did want to flag one question from somebody who noted that they were at 35 and 40% proficiency already. How much lower can they go? I obviously don't know anything about your school community, so there's no judgment on my part, but I would say that we had schools that saw 50-point drops from 70 to 20. Particularly, the weakness of testing as the focus is that if you have schools over-focus on it and they over-focus on meeting a relatively low bar, then they've gotten a huge number of students just over the line, and those students were often the ones who struggled the most, and so some of those schools saw the biggest drops. And we did have schools with 0 proficient students on the new standard. And not all of those schools were what I quote-unquote bad schools. They were not all schools that were in a turnaround situation. There were schools that were serving populations of students facing serious challenges. A school right near foster care homes and homeless shelters that turned over huge numbers of children every year, even in early elementary school, that were at that and were called some questions about how we were going to get students, that school community, to support students to meet the new bar. But the question wasn't, is the school, quote unquote, bad?
Josh, this is Joe. We talked a lot about what you did. What would you do differently, or what was your biggest area in which you didn't succeed?
That is a great question. Well, I'd say a couple things. I would have worked more closely with the advocates and supporters and the organizations who are working with our most historically underserved communities, particularly English language learners and students with special needs, to really think about what this meant and how we would work with them, and how we would work with them to support schools beyond the advocacy they were going to do around additional resources to help us figure out how to work smarter. I don't think we put enough time and attention there. And I would have wished for more forums for conversations with teachers. We had a bunch, but for places for teachers to raise very real concerns. Among the teaching corps, there are folks who just are doubters and or who are very frustrated in their school communities or mad at their principal and so not interested. But I don't think we reached as many teachers as I would have liked and helped create a place for a really constructive conversation. And I would have liked to have done better there as well. I remain convinced that teachers who have places for constructive conversations and opportunities to learn this work get very excited about it. And if they're not in those settings, they are likely to get quite frustrated or think it's just, the theme of the month or the year, and figuring out how to break up that sort of unproductive frame is a place I wish we had worked more.
Thank you.
This is Leslie, and I was wondering about, now that when the city had come through the publication of the scores and came through the media, then after that time, did the message change for the following year? How did the message change for media or for teachers, for the community? What was the next step in the plan?
I think that's where I'm not sure New York's experience is that constructive. I mean, the reality was the tests occurred in August. The Democratic primary was the beginning of September. The mayoral election was in November, and we had a new mayor by January 1st. And the new chancellor has taken up a bunch of this work and has done, as new chancellors and mayors are right to do, figured out how to put their own imprint on it, I think, and to figure out how to tackle some of the things that we didn't move. So a lot of the answer in New York really is around that massive change in the political context. Underneath that, the substantive work in schools has continued. One of our key ways of framing the work around the Common Core that started in 2011 was this idea of the citywide instructional expectations, of framing how to take on this challenge to schools and embedding that in our supports. And they released a new set of expectations for 15-16 that are in the midst of the work being done. So I think that's all I'll say. There's a lot more, but I think our goal was to make sure that this remained an instructional conversation about what needs to change for schools and not become a political football in a fight over who was going to replace the mayor. Because often in those fights, the content gets lost. And I think in that we were fairly successful. The candidate de Blasio named this challenge. He named it on much the same terms as we've been talking about the importance of the new baseline in college and career readiness. And certainly the new chancellor has put her spin on the strategy to get there, but has embraced that work as well.
Thank you.
This is Ralph. Josh, I think maybe we have time for one more question. And one of the things that we're hearing a lot right now in the current politics is about reducing the number of tests. And I'm seeing that across a number of states. So the amount of testing. The argument at the same time for Common Core linked tests is essentially better tests. Is there anything that strikes you about, is there a contradiction, or do you see any hope that these new kinds of tests are going to be helpful?
Worthy of another webinar, or maybe a
That's right. Maybe that's the next one.
My quick answer is that people are, and I speak as a father of 2 school-age children. Frustration with the tests come from a couple different places. First is when the tests are not very good, when they don't look like a productive use of time. And where that's the case, there is an important conversation to be had about how to make them productive. And I think PARCC and Smarter Balance put a huge amount of effort into getting there. The second question is around what are they used for. And I think we have an important challenge ahead of us on that point, where there is value in accountability. What I saw in New York City over and again was school communities telling me that they were working as hard as they could on behalf of kids, and I'd go in and have my inferences about what that looked like, And then I'd look at the data and see one school with very similar demographics graduating, 75, 85% of their students with 25% fully ready for college, and another school graduating 55% with none ready for college. And you can't have the conversation if you don't have the data. And so it's important to have. But having the data doesn't mean you get to use it for everything. And the degree to which, I think another portion of the resistance is the degree to which the data becomes a way to bash schools, teachers, principals, and kids. And that isn't productive, particularly when it goes beyond the bounds of where the psychometricians analyzing the tests are comfortable, because then we as policymakers are on very shaky ground and shakier than we belong. I think another portion of the challenge around testing is around what we call the New York State local measures of student learning, which seem like a good idea, but generates a lot more time on testing. And we haven't solved the implementation issues on that by any stretch of the imagination. And so need to, I think, slow it down till we get it right and don't set ourselves up to be concluding things from tests about the readiness of teachers that the tests themselves can't demonstrate. And the final point I'll make is where our teaching practice is simply not strong enough, and where sometimes it's because of fear, and sometimes it's because of lack of strong support or lack of knowledge about how to teach, but where our teachers use the tests as a replacement for curriculum. And anywhere that is, every parent has every right to say, for the love of all things, please do not teach to the test. My children deserve more. And I think that's at the heart of it. To get testing right, we have to situate it in what we think our children need and what kind of instruction we want them to get. So thank you.
Thank you. Turn it back to Teresa.
And so we are right at 4:30, and so I would like to bring this to a close. Many, many thanks to Josh, to Rolf, Lauren, Joe, and Leslie for being such lively and active participants. And many thanks, too, to our audience. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to more than just a fraction of your questions, but I see how passionate and invested you are in this issue, and so we sincerely appreciate your time and attention in attending this webinar. We would like to ask you to take a minute to complete our satisfaction survey. Your feedback is very important to us, and so we hope you will just take a couple of minutes to fill it out. Thank you very much, and have a good day. I thought this was a great session.